There she is. I hate that voice. Every time I record an episode, Alex complains and she's going to do it again. That the first 3 minutes she has to cut because it's me complaining about that awful woman. So, right. Hello and welcome to another episode of History Hack. The guys have gone out again and left me keys to the castle. So I decided to try something different. And I have got Kenneth Harl with me, who is a scholar, author, and classicist, whose previous works include the Ottoman Empire, the fall of the pagans and the origins of medieval Christianity, and origins of great ancient civilizations. But he's here today to talk about his new book, Empire of the Steppes, Nomadic Tribes and Who Shaped Civilization. Kenneth, welcome to History Hack. How are you doing?
I'm doing very well, and thank you so much for inviting me.
Yeah, no. When the email had popped into the collective inbox with nomadic people of the steppes, like, this isn't something we've covered in a long while. This is definitely a subject that we should talk about. It's quite niche. Hang on, what have I just done there? Okay, so let's start at the beginning. What do we know about the early history of the peoples who lived on the steppes?
Well, it's a combination of archaeology and historical linguistics, plus analogies to later, better documented periods about steppe life. And as best we can tell from the archaeological record, it's closely connected with the invention of the wheel and the domestication of the horse as a beast of burden. The horses were probably originally domesticated for winter food. The horses on the South Russian steppes represented one of the largest concentration of horses in the world, say about 4500 BC. And it took a long time to breed the horses that we know today. The process wasn't completed till about 2000 BC. But in doing so, these early nomads gained an animal that would allow them to travel quickly, to scout out areas for grasslands and water, also to herd their animals, but above all, to pull the mobile homes that are the hallmark of steppe pastoralism. That is, they would move from area to area during the seasons to follow the water and grass patterns, and could sustain large herds of cattle, sheep, goats, which provided the meat, milk, and the fermented drink, which Mongols called kumish, which is fermented mare's milk, very alcoholic and very important in all sorts of ritual feastings. And this pattern was perfected somewhere on the South Russian steppes, approximately, say 3800 BC. And contrary to our notions of invasions in the historical period, the movement of nomads went from west to east because the first nomads were on the Russian steppes, and they slowly moved east to bring their way of life to the central steppes, largely represented by Kazakhstan today, and then to cross the Altai Mountains into the eastern steppes, into Mongolia, and to bring that way of life there. Archaeology allows us to reconstruct the daily life and also to get some sense of the patterns, the migrations. Then you have comparative linguistics, in which these early nomads spoke an Indo-European language. It's often designated Proto-Indo-European. It's the mother tongue of many of the languages from Ireland to India today. And the distribution of all of these languages is connected with early steppe movements, which essentially went from west to east. Somewhere around 2000 BC or shortly before, there was a very large-scale migration, or a series of migrations into Central Europe and Northern Europe that brought the Indo-European languages there. There had been an earlier migrations into the Balkans that brought the Hittite languages into what are now Turkey, later the Greek language into the Greek peninsula. Probably Armenia is an offshoot of one of these early Anatolian languages that ended up in Eastern Anatolia, in the Caucasus areas. So all of these migrations represented early steppe movements out of the core lands in South Russia. And those migrations and language families are pretty well determined. We've been able to figure that out pretty accurately. Unfortunately, we don't have written records. We don't have individuals we could talk to in any way or who speak to us through their writings, but we're at least able to get an idea of the world they lived in, some idea of the gods they worshiped, the type of life they endured on the steppes, which is extremely difficult with extremes of temperatures between the winter and the summer, constant relentless movement for water, which is all important. And the fact that nomads, when forced to, could move very quickly over great distances. So that's how we learn about the earlier nomads. And then we start getting writings by historians of the sedentary civilizations. Herodotus, the father of history, at least that's what the Greeks would call him. And I would call him the same. He's the father of Western history. Less charitable people call him the father of lies, but that's being a little too facetious for me.
I think that's what Paulina falls into. She's not a fan of Herodotus.
Well, I'm a big fan of Herodotus, and he's proved to be more accurate than his detractors, especially in the 19th century, claimed. And he does like to tell good stories. And in that regard, he would be very similar to a Southern fellow from the United States. And the attitude is, you have no business telling a story unless you improve it. And so he's embroidering details that are sometimes a bit questionable. And some of his stories about ancient Egypt are just pure fun. It's tourist language. It's tourist talk. But he is observant, and he spoke to a lot of eyewitnesses who knew the nomads of his day in southern Russia, whom he calls Scythians, and he gives very good reports about them. Burial customs, including human sacrifice and the sacrifice of horses. This persisted down to the Mongol age. The patterns of movements, the vast trains of ox and horse-drawn carts across the grasslands, burial practices, and so his account is extremely useful. He also records the first war of a sedentary civilization against the nomads, and that is the Persian Empire that attempted to conquer these steppes, or at least chastise the Scythians, and of course it ended in failure. The great King Darius had to withdraw out of Europe back into Asia. This weakness was a signal to his Greek subjects to revolt, and Herodotus reports the Scythians were constantly sending messages to the Greeks. It's time to report against your Persian oppressor, and that rebellion led to the wars that ended at the Battle of Salamis and the significant defeat of the Persian Empire. The Scythians were part of the cause of that chain of events. So they play a very important role in the geopolitics of Eurasia, as well as the transmission of technology and ideas across the Eurasian steppes.
And yeah, they also sent Darius the cryptic message of like a dead frog, a dead bird, and 5 arrows, and no one's entirely certain what it meant, but
yeah, and the message read that I think unless you could leap like a frog or burrow into the ground like a hare, our arrows will seek you out and get you. And it's always dangerous advising a great king, because they're prone to kill the messenger or the interpreter of a message, which is not optimistic, let us say. So I've often envisioned situations of who was the messenger who informed King Darius of the defeat of his army at the Battle of Marathon. I certainly wouldn't want that guy's job.
No.
This is a danger in all of these early monarchies. Well, even in modern dictators today, I could imagine. One reads reports of how, the quintessential dictator of all times, Adolf Hitler, would go into rages whenever someone would point out reality to him. And that's a problem of anyone in power, becoming so insulated from reality, you live in your own fantasy world. But that aside, Darius learned very quickly that logistically, he could not sustain a large army on the grasslands. His men were not able to endure that without immense amount of supplies, which were essentially beyond the capacity of his empire. And he couldn't bring the nomads to a set battle where he could defeat them decisively. There's no conventional targets. There are no cities to capture. There isn't a government offices. These were confederations that could quickly move. They would move their women and children well out of the range of the enemy armies because they're living on these mobile homes. And then the cavalry would skirmish, ambush, fight these running battles and just wear the enemy down, usually denying them water sources. Herodotus reports the poisoning of wells, which I'm sure was discouraging for the Persian army. They would chase these nomads over the steppes, finally arrive at some water source and found that it had been polluted. And under those circumstances, Darius just declared victory and withdrew. Everyone knew a great king can't admit defeat. I mean, that's if he does, it has to be his subordinates who screwed up.
It's the subordinates.
He personally commanded the campaign, which was another mistake politically, and so withdrew. And it was a humiliating retreat, and it was seen as such by many of his subjects. Such defeats risk rebellion in a multinational empire. It was a difficult lesson to learn. Alexander the Great, who encountered these same nomads out in Central Asia, his aims were much more restricted. What he wanted to do was to control the flow of these people over his border. So he would set up forts to control and regulate markets. He carried out a strike north of the Jaxartes River, where he defeated the nomads in a very clever trap, ambushing people who were expert at ambushing, and then recruited large numbers of these horse archers into his armies, which he happily marched off to India. And these are the ways you have to deal with these nomads. You have to come to terms with them. They depend very heavily on the markets of cities. They need to obtain foodstuffs, which they can't produce themselves. These would be dried fruits, vegetables, bread, and of course, grape wine or beer is a very high prestige commodity for them. All sorts of manufactured goods that craftsmen could devise, but the nomads themselves don't have the specialists. And so if you give them access to these markets, you can dictate terms, regulate the trade. You could allow some of them to settle as immigrants or recruit them as soldiers. That would relieve the population pressure off the steppes, because you're not forcing them into the situation. If they can't trade, they will raid. Alexander perfected that system. And the Chinese emperors did the same. They came up with this arrangement called the Five Baits. It was devised by the Han emperors of China, who are more or less the contemporaries with Imperial Rome. And they dealt with a nomadic group called the Xiongnu, a very powerful confederation on the Mongolian steppes, one of our best documented cases. And they would provide a Chinese princess and hook these, they would be known as the Chanyu. That would be the title of these rulers. Modo Chanyu was the founder of this confederation in the 2nd century BC. And they would provide with the princesses whole retinues of specialists, craftsmen, musicians, lots of silk and fancy products, which the ruler could hand out to his vassals. and he could boast that I am a cousin to the Emperor of China, which was the center of the world to these people. And it increased his own standing and provided all sorts of fancy prestige gifts to his important supporters and foodstuffs and essential goods to his population. It also then allowed the Chinese emperor at a relatively low cost to defend his frontiers without the necessity of trying to send large armies north into Mongolia to try to seek out and destroy these nomads. Now, that changed with the Emperor Wu Di, who decided to go to war with the nomads, and he died in the year 87 BC, and he framed a policy of these long columns penetrating into Mongolia, mutually supporting columns, converging on a nomadic army and destroying them, deporting large numbers of people and animals, and waging a war that almost verged on genocidal. And in the end, his results were really mixed. He gained a number of victories at incredibly high costs. Thousands of animals and men died of exhaustion trying to fight these wars north of the Great Wall. And ultimately, it was a strategic draw, in my opinion. The nomads were extremely formidable foes. And that was true starting in the early Iron Age when they developed saddles so men would ride horses rather than ride chariots into battle. And on these horses, they were mounted with what is called a composite bow. It looks like half a figure eight, which is one of the most deadly missile weapons ever created before the advent of firearms. And these nomadic horsemen could skirmish, ambush, engage enemy from afar with no danger to themselves, and prove one of the most effective warriors of the entire ancient and medieval world. Seldom were they ever defeated in battle.
Yeah, they were, from the little bit I know about them, they were absolutely feared. So when I know we're going to get to them later, but when the Golden Horde roll up through into to the European border, everyone's terrified that the Mongols could just smash right through Europe.
Yeah, and Matthew Paris, the Anglo-Norman chronicler, was the one who said these people must come from Tartarus, which is the classical word for the underworld, and hence they got the name Tartars. They've been released by the devil himself. Well, sitting comfortably in England, far away from the Mongols, you could name them as such. The Russians, on the other hand, had a lot of other names for these invaders, which were far less flattering because they experienced the full fury of what they call the Mongol yoke. And with the exception of Novgorod and Pskov in the far north, the Mongols managed to capture and destroy every significant Russian town in the campaign of Batu, the grandson of Genghis Khan, and then in 1242 invaded Europe, smashing especially the Hungarian army in a battle that just sent the Europeans scrambling. Oh my gosh, they'll be in Rome in no time. Actually, they had outrun their logistical train, but also they received news that the then great Khan, Ogadai, had passed away, and Batu withdrew out of Europe because there was going to be a major election, and he was afraid that his political opponents would gain control of the throne and go after him. And so it was, to a large extent, the internal politics of the Mongol Empire that called a halt to their advance into Europe.
A lot of people call it one of the greatest what-ifs of European history.
Yeah, I indulge some speculation about that, particularly Frederick II, how he would have handled the Mongols. He might have been able to oppose them, but the danger would be Frederick managed to alienate not only the Pope, but many of his fellow monarchs. And you could find some alliance of the Italian communes and maybe even the papacy itself with the Mongols just to get rid of Frederick. Yeah, he had the distinction of having a crusade preached against him.
Oh, wow.
One of the most colorful figures of the 13th century, to say the least. Stupor Mundi, as he was called, his Latin title, a wonder of the world. The Muslims actually liked him because he spoke Arabic and he knew Islamic philosophy and religion, and the caliph of, or say the Sultan of Egypt, gave Jerusalem back because of that. We can give it back to him. He's a respectable monarch. Anyway, Jerusalem belonged to Al-Kamil. He was actually belonged to a relative, so he wasn't giving anything away he controlled. But at the time when he received Jerusalem back in the Sixth Crusade, he was under excommunication. Frederick racked up quite a few excommunications in his career. So, in any event, militarily, he might have been up to the job of facing a Mongol army. On the other hand, politically, you may have found a large number of his European contemporaries in the Mongol ranks, spoiling to get even with him. And if so, that would have been not too dissimilar from Kublai Khan's conquest of China, which, in order to conquer China, Kublai Khan had to depart from the usual massacres of large numbers of civilians to terrorize the opponents, and to hire lots of Chinese infantry and launch on the Yangtze River and its tributaries a Chinese fleet. And so in many ways, Kublai Khan conquered China with a Chinese army and a Chinese flotilla. And there were a lot of Mongolian, cavalry thrown in as well, but the Mongolian cavalry was not going to operate very successfully in the rice paddies and the hot weather of southern China. To conquer China required a complete change of military organization and the types of soldiers you needed. And Kublai Khan very adeptly did so, and won over many of the officers of the Sung dynasty who were just fed up with the incompetence of the Sung court and saw Kublai Khan as an alternative. And so he was both successful on the political front as well as the military front, and achieved what no other nomadic ruler ever achieved, and that was the conquest of all of China. And in writing the book, I gained immense admiration for Kublai Khan. We were talking before the show how you knew of Kublai Khan before Genghis Khan, which is common in the West because of Marco Polo. Polo traveled to the court and wrote this fabulous account of Xanadu and all the riches of Cathay, which inspired the Europeans to sail west in order to reach the fabled land of Kublai Khan. And instead, they bumped into these two new continents. And Marco wrote the book, in prison, and been captured by the Genoese, and is dictating it to his fellow prisoner, who's writing it in a form of French. The book was written so Marco could recover the fortune he lost on his return from China. He and his dad and uncle lost all their money just making their way back to Venice. And so Marco was put in the position he had to write a bestseller if he was going to recover his fortune. And that book became the model for the traveler's accounts, and all sorts of fellows tried to live off it by imitating. Famous one is Geoffrey de Manville, who is the original accidental tourist. He probably never crossed the English Channel, but wrote a marvelous account in the 14th century about all the fabulous animals and lands and rulers in the East. It's a complete ripoff of Marco's book, and it was considered an equal to Marco Polo's book, and both were read by Christopher Columbus, by the way. who took them seriously as accounts. So that's a nice aside.
The way we lived before copyright laws.
Well, that's how Kubla Khan's remembered, and he's remembered, of course, in Coleridge's poem, and in the Xanadu in Citizen Kane, the famous movie about William Randolph Hearst. The Mongols themselves looked to Genghis Khan as their great national hero. And Kubla Khan, for all of his achievements, is despised as an outside conqueror. Yet, in my opinion, he was the one who reunited China after 400 years of disunity. And one wonders if China would ever have been reunited into a single state had it not been for Kubla Khan. Because historically, the pattern was for China to divide into 3 or more warring empires once a central empire collapsed. And you have the South, the North, and the Northwest, all of them very distinct regions with distinct histories. And Kubla Khan managed to put all of those under his control and hand that empire down to his successors. And it sparked a national resistance that expelled the Mongols and led to the building of the Great Wall as we see it today. The masonry walls tourists go to visit were really built in the aftermath of the Mongol conquest. It was almost an emotional response that never again would these invaders come into the Middle Kingdom. We're going to build the most formidable walls on the earth to prevent that from ever happening again. Whereas the wall system before the Mongol conquest was much simpler. It was made of rammed earth and ditches. It was not a continuous. It would be very similar to the type of walls the Romans built in Europe. They were very comparable types of construction. They were not massive masonry walls at all. They were improvements on the natural features, and large sections of the border, which were deserts or mountains, would not be fortified at all. You just need to patrol them periodically.
Yeah. You can't. They're fairly impossible.
So Kubla Khan also inspired the Chinese to build one of their most important tourist attractions. So give them credit for that. I always said the Roman Empire built the tourist industry for the Mediterranean world between 70 AD and 235 AD. So this is comparable.
That's a good point, actually. I know this is going off a little bit, but a friend of mine sent me a meme the other day of the end of the Great Wall of China, where it goes into the sea, and they said this is the Great Wall. It was built to keep the Mongols out, and underneath it, it's got a comment saying, "Dude, why didn't the Mongols just get in a little boat and just go around it?"
Yeah. Well, the problem of all walls, unless you patrol them and man them, they're not very effective. I mean, you living in the UK know that if you've at all studied the Hadrianic or the Antonine walls in Britain, these were set up with all sorts of forts, patrols. The Celtic tribes to the north of the wall were on the Roman payroll. They're very costly to maintain. And those of my compatriots who think that they can build this absurd 3,000-mile wall across the southern border of the United States are just fooling themselves.
History shows us the walls don't work.
There's no way you could man, and you'd have to tell Americans to shoot women and children. And most Americans really don't take kindly to murdering people to whom they see no threat from. I mean, it's just a ridiculous political issue. But I live in a country with many silly political issues. I'll just leave it at that.
That's right. So do I. England's going a bit crazy there. We've got the same thing, but it's not the wall; it's the English Channel. We need to patrol the entire Channel coast. That didn't work when the Germans were coming.
Yeah. Well, wait until you see your tax bill after 1 year of that. That ought to finish that idea quickly. And that would, that's something that I've considered in the book, is these There's only one instance, and that was the Tang Emperor Taizong in the 7th century, who actually conquered nomadic heartlands, which would be the eastern steppes then occupied by people known as the Gurk Turks or the Sky Turks. And this was the first Turkish Khanate. And it was incorporated actually into the Chinese Empire. But this Chinese emperor was exceptional. He grew up in northern China. He loved riding and hunting. He could inspire many Turks to take service with him. Probably a third of his officers were actually Turkish nomads, and he preferred the nomadic life of his Turkish subjects to the very, very studied life of the Mandarin bureaucrats who ran the empire. He was the only ruler anywhere in Eurasia to conquer significant regions of the steppes and rule them directly before the advent of firearms. And when he died, his successors really could not maintain this system, and the Turkish Khanates became independent again. What developed in the later Tang period was this symbiosis, according to some Chinese historians, that the Turks furnished soldiers that were vital for maintaining the power of the later Tang emperors, since they faced repeated rebellions over high taxes, oppressive administrators, corrupt lawyers. Seems corrupt lawyers was a couple adjective and noun, since the first lawyers are known in ancient Sumer. You know, the earliest laws we have from the Sumerian city-state of Uruk-Agina is, oh, the lawyers are corrupt. You know, I should be kind about them, because when you need a lawyer, they're really vital. And I've trained many a future lawyer in my classes. But I will invoke Samuel Johnson's comment that I never heard anything ill said of this man, but he is rumored to be a lawyer. So significantly enough, in modern Turkey, there aren't any lawyer jokes. I've told lawyer jokes in Turkish to my wife, who is Turkish, and she just doesn't find them funny, because the lawyers are part of the political system, and they use Roman law, civil law. It wouldn't affect be a bench trial before a lawyer, an avukat, as they would say in Turkish. And so that joke doesn't translate into modern Turkish in any case. Well, that's a little far afield, but the success of Taizong is exceptional. And it is one that really was astonishing to me, what an extraordinary ruler he was. And you come to admire some of these Chinese emperors who could think in such long-term, strategic terms in dealing with the nomads. And Taizong was clearly one of the most successful, if not the most successful. We don't quite have a counterpart like that in Europe, or even in the Middle East. He's an extraordinary ruler. He's right.
Talking of extraordinary leaders, we couldn't really talk about We couldn't really talk about nomadic kingdoms and fighting without mentioning Attila the Hun. How successful? I mean, it was a stupid question, but how successful was he?
Well, you raised the question of one of the great ifs of history, and to some extent, I always see Attila as the great if. If he had not died prematurely, he would have been in his mid-40s when he burst this blood vessel by overindulging in a winter festival when he had married this German girl, and had invaded Italy a second time and claimed his Roman bride, the Empress Honoria. He might have created some kind of composite state of the Western Roman Empire and his Hun Confederation, quite similar to such states you found in North China, where nomads would rule part of the steppes and control the northern Chinese cities. The most successful were the Northern Wei dynasty, who were nomads, who really were important for the development of Buddhism in China. that might have been a possibility, but instead he died. The Western Empire was so compromised, and the Hun attacks had driven so many Germans into the Roman Empire that the German tribes ended up being the successors of the Western Roman Empire and established the kingdoms that evolved into the nation states of Europe today. He tipped the balance decisively to the Germanic tribes. However, at the time of his death, these Germanic peoples had long been in contact with Roman institutions. A number of the tribes had embraced a form of Christianity. They were devoted to Christ. They just couldn't quite get the Ten Commandments straight. But at least, when they entered towns, they would respect churches and carried out more what was blackmail rather than plunder. They perpetuated Roman institutions, particularly the Western Church, which become the basis of the medieval West. But Attila might have changed the destinies of Europe. It could have looked very differently if the Western Empire had been perpetuated by a Hun conqueror. Probably you could assign the word High King or Khan to Attila as his title, and his Roman Empress. And if they had children, well, they may have inherited this state. I mean, it's all speculation. But clearly, he had posed for the first time to the Roman Empire, which happened to be divided into two empires at this point, an existential threat. And the Romans had never faced that before from a nomadic peoples. Their previous experience with nomads in Central Europe had been Rome always had the upper hand. These tribes were relatively small. They were easily divided among themselves to fight civil wars, settle old scores. They could be incorporated into the Roman army as auxiliaries, or they could be put on payroll to patrol the frontiers. They did not have any experience with a vast confederation of tribes headed up by a charismatic ruler who had access to horse archers, plus many of the Germanic tribes of Central Europe who were his subjects. And Attila was a quick study. He had many Roman captives who could build engines of war. In the 440s, when he attacked into the Balkans, his army is capable of capturing cities to the shock of the Emperor Theodosius II and his court. Theodosius was hardly much of an emperor. The government was really run by his older sister, Ilia Pulcharia, who called the shots. And he himself was content to practice his calligraphy in his palace. Very lazy ruler, didn't even read his own Theodosian code, most likely. Just the Roman rulers of the 5th century AD are really remarkably undistinguished lot, who really were not up to the task at all, and so it would be people at court who would dominate. And in the case of the Western Emperor, it was the General Aetius who controlled foreign policy and had an alliance with Attila until 450, when Attila broke the alliance to claim his bride, the Empress Honoria. She had appealed to Attila for reasons that are very unclear. She was going to be married off to this boring senior senator to keep her from scheming against her brother, the emperor, Valentinian III. And so she wrote a letter to Attila pleading for aid and sent a ring. And Attila assumed this was a marriage proposal and then demanded Gaul and Spain as the dowry. And even a cravenly Emperor Valentinian couldn't agree to that.
No, it's pretty extreme.
Most of the Western, they'd lost Britain, and Africa was in the hands of the Vandals at this point. So what little was left outside of Italy was going to be given to the Huns, and so he refused. And Attila, whose ancestors came from the Eastern Steppes, in my opinion, took this as the greatest insult because he was waiting for such an offer. You know, on the Eastern steppes, the Chinese emperor always sent a princess to marry the most charismatic ruler of the most important nomadic confederation. This was a sign that he had made it politically. And Attila was probably waiting for this, and then he gets the proposal, and then they refuse to honor it. I mean, this is a war of, this is a matter of honor. And
absolutely.
He, you know, from his viewpoint, I got to invade Gaul and ransack the place.
It's what I'm owed.
Yeah, you know, he doesn't understand that, you know, Roman citizens don't marry non-citizens, and particularly non-citizens who are not even Christians. Whereas for the Chinese emperor, it's no problem. You know, you have a harem, you've got plenty of daughters you can hand out to rulers. He just didn't understand Roman matrimonial law, that's all.
And thus collapsed the Roman Empire due to problems with the translations.
Yeah, I mean, the next year he invades Italy, and there's absolutely no army to oppose him because the Roman army at this point is made up largely of German mercenaries or allies, as they like to call them. They're essentially mercenaries. And Visigoths and Franks will fight to defend their homes in Gaul, but they're not going to die for Italy. And so the road to Rome was open to him. He could well have marched on Rome and taken it. And this famous meeting with senior senators and Pope Leo I, they dissuade him from marching on Rome for reasons that are unclear. And Attila retreated, probably assuming he would come back the next year and face very little resistance. For the benefit of the Roman court, the Western court, he died unexpectedly. But there were no effective forces to oppose the Huns' march on Rome. They could have occupied the city pretty easily. I would love to know what Leo really said to Attila in that meeting.
He must have offered him a massive bribe or something. It's the only thing you could think of.
Attila would have been impressed by the stature of Leo, who's the first Roman pope of great rank. He wrote the famous tome or letter in 449 that became the touchstone of orthodoxy for the Western Church. And it was accepted at the Council of Chalcedon in 451. That's the first time a Latin text was accepted as canonical in these great councils. And he is remembered as the most important pope in making the papacy the real master of the city of Rome. That the Roman aristocracy had particularly held out for paganism for a long time, but by his pontificate in the mid-5th century, the aristocracy had gone Christian, and the great Roman families now provided the popes, and Leo came from such a family, and starts a line of very, very impressive papal figures who made Rome the capital of Western Christianity to a large extent. So Attila would have been impressed. He would have been worried about his logistics, malaria. There had been poor harvests that year. Food was in short supply. He had wasted a lot of time besieging and capturing cities in northern Italy, particularly the city of Aquileia, which is the predecessor of Venice. In Milan, he saw a great mural in the imperial palace and commissioned it to be repainted with himself in the center, and the Western and Eastern emperors rendering homage to him.
Nice.
He understood. It was always great going to his camp because we have very good descriptions of it by an Eastern Roman diplomat named Priscus, and this was recreated by a Hungarian national painter in the 19th century, the Feast of Attila, where Attila is seated in the center on very modest fare. He's using wooden dishes and all, because he gives all the plunder out to his supporters. He's surrounded by his supporters at a great table. And then at the far ends are the Eastern and Western envoys who are allowed, given permission to be at the edge of the great table. And Till is just lording it over these envoys from the courts of Ravenna and Constantinople. And he always would deal with Roman envoys when they were signing treaties, as happens first in 435, where the Roman envoys would appear, and he would stay on his horse with his supporter, looking down and dictate terms from his horse. You guys are just, one step above peasants. Now go back to your master and tell him this is what the tribute is this year. And he is very good at staging these events, I'm sure.
Because when you talk about the Huns, everyone thinks of the unbridled barbarians, but he's really got a handle on statecraft and projecting that image of I'm in charge, I am the leader. I will sit on my horse. You're down there, I'm above you, and that's something you wouldn't put with barbarianism, if you know what I mean.
Yeah, well, these barbarian images particularly gain currency. Well, they're common in the Middle Ages, and the idea of the Mongols being Tartars, you can trace that image of steppe nomads going back to Gog and Magog, the legends of Alexander the Great, building this great wall that shut out the unclean peoples, the nomads, and they will come at the time of the apocalypse, announcing the end of days. And Alexander was credited of building this wall somewhere in the Caucasus in either the Derbent or the Dariel Pass, two passes we know Alexander never reached in his conquests, but it's a good story. But when you look at the historical record, you realize they are extremely adept at learning from their neighbors and need to. They also have an incredibly good knowledge of the world, because the development of the Silk Road, probably in the 3rd century BC, that linked essentially the Mediterranean world to China across this vast caravan route, crossed large sections of Eurasia where the nomads dwelled, and these people traded with the merchants along the way. They hired out their warriors as guards. They also, later on in the 10th century, the Turks bred camels that were ideal for this route. They made an enormous amount of money providing camels to the caravan trade. The nomadic peoples learned technology. They learned different religions such as Buddhism, Christianity, Islam, Manichaeism by contact with the merchants. They have a very steep learning curve. They are not a bunch of uncouth barbarians. And in writing this book, several of these nomadic peoples, notably the Khazars in southern Russia and the Uyghurs, who at the time dwelled in what is now Mongolia, not in the western reaches of China, where they ended up in the 9th century, both established their own empires, confederations, on the steppes, adopted a religion brought by merchants. The Khazars, at least the upper classes, embraced Judaism. The Uyghurs embraced this religion known as Manichaeism that emerged in Mesopotamia in the 3rd century AD, both monotheistic creeds. They had their scribes invent writing to keep records, and they promoted trade and ran very successful nomadic empires on the steppes. This is not what the stereotype would expect.
No.
At all. And they're, as I say, they have constant contact with merchants and missionaries. They're well aware of the people around them. And if you assume the position of Genghis Khan, he's at the top of the world looking around. He sees Europe to the far west. That would be to his right. To the left is China. In front of him would be what we would call the Middle East. And he knows a lot more about the geography of the world than the contemporary rulers of these sedentary civilizations. Um, and
I
he's
mean,
able to obtain an enormous amount of information from missionaries and merchants, or tribes, warriors who had served as soldiers in the armies of these states. And he's able to frame a very successful strategy in his campaigns because he's so well informed.
yeah, because talk from a European perspective, we're very insular. We've almost got this, and it comes through to the British later in the 19th century and even up to now, this kind of arrogance of, well, we're the center of civilization. These people are just, what do they know? But because they're nomadic and they've got access to so much information and they're willing to listen to all this other information, they're much more informed than we are in the West.
Yeah, and being one of your American cousins, we inherited from our British cousins the same arrogance. Americans are sometimes quite astonished that people don't speak English and yet can be very intelligent. Americans are often very, very poor at learning other languages and understanding that a language is an interpretation of the world. Nomadic peoples did know several languages, and they had a strategy of speaking their own language, usually a Turkish language in the Middle Ages, but were able to communicate in Iranian or Arabic or even Chinese because it was necessary in order to conduct trade, and it was a great advantage to speak the other's language. We know Attila the Hun, to go back to Attila, he had officials excellent in Greek and Latin, and I suspect he knew enough colloquial Latin and Greek to communicate when he wanted to. And
Yeah.
I'm sure at meetings he would feign ignorance of these languages and would be listening to what the Romans might be saying among themselves, without giving away the fact he understood it. And he would work through translators. This was probably typical of many nomadic wars. The founder of the Shuangnu Empire, Modu Shanyu, he commissioned his officials to create a script based on Chinese ideograms to express his own language, so that he could keep records. So they're not a bunch of untutored, illiterate barbarians. You get these images in textbooks of the 19th century. There's a famous one done by a French artist that got into these national Czech textbooks showing Attila the Hun invading France, the pitiless conqueror, the barbarian. But they really are far more sophisticated than most people would think. And writing this book was a way of correcting that image. Many scholars know this, but in the general public, it's understandable. They're not involved in these, very learned and sometimes difficult to follow debates about linguistics, archaeology, whatever. And so what I try to give is a plausible picture of what these people were like, and how we can appreciate them and realize that they were an important link among the civilizations of Eurasia. Without the Pax Mongolica, as I like to call it, gunpowder might not have reached Western Europe and triggered the gunpowder revolution that changed the world.
Absolutely.
It took the Europeans to create the artillery that they could put on ocean-going vessels, but without that technology, they wouldn't have had those weapons, and those weapons changed the world.
And coming back to British imperialism, gave us the edge over 3 continents.
Of course, the thin red line of, the British could produce the most effective soldiers because they perfected the firing system, the platoon form of firing, on concentrating on targets. And there's lots of good examples of that. Noseworthy's book on tactics of the 17th and 18th century has 2 volumes are one of the best examples of how the British line of fire was the most successful. And the Americans, contrary to the images that they claim that, we stood behind trees and shot the Brits, really the only way the Americans defeated the British is by creating a European-style army, the Continentals, that could match the British in a set battle, such as Saratoga. Essentially, you had to adopt British tactics and perfect them to that level if you're going to have any chance of defeating them.
Yeah, von Steubing, I believe, was the German,
Yeah.
another type of Hun who came over to kill them.
Oh, Frederick the Great, yeah, one of my favorites. They sandbagged every, his father was the Great Elector, sandbagged every tall man he could find for the guard. They all had to be 6 foot and taller. I think they sandbagged an Italian priest at mass. I know what his bodyguard. Yeah, again, the transmission of that information, also making of paper, the use of paper money, which was a Chinese invention going back at least to the Song Empire, was very successfully used by Kublai Khan, backed up by silver, to extend credit and specie. And it was introduced into the Middle East by the Ilkhans, that is the descendants of Hulagu. It eventually was abandoned, but the notion of paper money, all sorts of medicinal medicines, drugs, food, got exchanged across Eurasia for the Mongol peace. Once the horrors of the conquest were over, trade resumed, and the Mongol Khans had every reason to maintain the trade. They prospered off it. Now, the way they waged war, and this has been pointed out by many writers and as well as readers, was horrifying. Even by the standards of the age, the Mongol way of war was brutal. There may have been no Geneva Convention, usually the defeated were enslaved, but the massacres of populations on a wide scale was intended to break resistance. And it came out of the nomadic traditions of warfare when clans clashed on the steppes. Defeated were essentially wiped out because the victors didn't have the means to support those extra mouths. Well, you apply this policy to Chinese cities and you get massacres approaching, genocidal levels. And these charges have been raised against Genghis Khan and his sons and grandsons, Tamerlane, the last emulator of Genghis Khan, and even Attila the Hun, because this is the way warfare was waged on the steppes. It was brutal. Unless you surrendered immediately, all bets were off. They took the city and they did what they wanted. And even if you surrendered, the terms were harsh. They would deport craftsmen, people who had useful skills. They would plunder the city. Large numbers of men would be taken into military service and used as cannon fodder to assault the next city. And that's when you got terms. I mean, you surrendered without opposing the invader. So by the standards of the age, these nomadic conquerors waged war more brutally than their contemporaries. And their contemporaries were not nice guys to the defeated. I mean, read some of the stunts Frederick II pulled in Italy, catapulting civilians into the city to break their will. These are fellow hardly anything like the modern rules of war. And unfortunately, those rules are all too often honored in the breach rather than the observance. So that's the dark side. And that contributes a great deal to the images of the nomads as savage people, as beyond the pale. But you have to, again, understand that the warfare on the steppes was as brutal as could be, just like the conditions of living on those steppes.
Yeah, it's about survival.
Who are used to killing and surviving under the harshest of conditions. And to some extent, a reflex. This is how we wage war. This is
Yeah.
what it's about. And, they don't try to justify it. It's just how it is. Sobering thought.
Absolutely. And sobering thought to end on. This has been really in depth. We've covered a hell of a lot of ground. I think the questions went out the window, but it's been fantastic talking to you. Would you mind just reminding everyone the title of your book and when it's available and where they can grab it from?
It will be released in August. Bloomsbury Press is publishing in Great Britain and a division of HarperCollins in the United States. It's called Empires of the Steppes, how a history of the nomadic peoples. I forget the subtitle to it.
How shaped
how they shaped the modern world. That's it. How they shaped the modern world. I wrote a large part of it when I was in isolation during the pandemic. I had a lot of fun writing it. My wife is Turkish, as I alluded to, and I would use Mongol words to her, and she'd look at me in complete distaste and say, "That's bad Turkish," you know. When I would, she didn't recognize kumish, the fermented drink, at first until she turned it into Turkish kumish, a K instead of a Q, and she said, you know, she just thought, you know, that's bad Turkish. What are you speaking? The languages are close, and.
Yeah.
They're related, they're distinct, but they are from the same language family, and it makes the Mongol words very accessible to me, knowing Turkish and being in a bilingual marriage. I'm not sure sometimes what language we're speaking, and I often wonder, this is what happened on the steppes, you know. Yeah, my wife's first attempt in English was Janum Yemek Dolap input I, which I understand perfectly well. My soul, I'm putting the food in the refrigerator. It's a combination of Turkish and English words using a version of Turkish grammar, and I'm sure many a steppe family had a mix of Iranian and Turkish, or Mongolian and Turkish, in the way they communicate with each other.
That sounds like my German, where it kind of breaks up into different things. But also, what we'll try and do is we'll get your book on the. Hang on, just pause while a guy on the motorbike goes.
Yeah, it should be available by August 1st, I think.
Yeah, we'll get it into the online history hack bookstore, bookshop.org. That way, with every sale, the podcast gets a small amount of the money, and you get more money than if it went through a popular rainforest named website. Okay. If I name, I will get targeted by the next Jeff Bezos missile. Did I say Jeff Bezos? I meant some guy.
Well, my wife thanks you because she'll claim the royalties.
But thanks for coming on and talking to us today.
I enjoyed it immensely. Thank you so much for inviting me.
Let me just stop recording.